1960 is often referred to as the Year of Africa. In a matter of 12 months, 17 African nations acquired their independence from their colonial masters. 13 of those became independent of France, the world's second largest exporter of Independence Days. Yet most of those countries did not really break with France and maintained strong ties to their former metropole. In the so-called Francafrique, this cooperation, sometimes labeled as neocolonialist, remains a controversial issue to this day. I'm your host David, and this is the second part of our examination of French Sub-Saharan Africa. Today we're going to look at the independence of over a dozen African nations, how it came about, and a little bit on how it played out. This is the Cold War. If you haven't watched our previous video about French Sub-Saharan Africa, you should go do that now. But since I'm sure that you have watched it, you already know that the struggle against colonialism was not exclusively a fight for national liberation. More commonly, it was a struggle against colonial practices, in which Africans aimed to achieve the same social and political rights that French citizens already enjoyed. They wanted into France, not out of it. By the 1950s, African politicians such as Lamine Gueye or Félix Houphouët-Boigny had achieved a lot. African representatives sat in the French National Assembly, indigenous and forced labor had been abolished, and discrimination on the grounds of race was made illegal, on paper at the very least. Most notably, however, were changes that affected African public servants, who had their pay levels increased to match that of the Europeans. But each concession made by France in this field placed more constraints on the colonial budget, did little to improve the lives of the rural majority, and mostly provoked more demands from African politicians. For France, this cycle of demands and concessions became increasingly unsustainable. We also need to keep in mind that during the 1950s, the French colonial empire was on the retreat. The loss at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 led to the French withdrawal from Indochina, and that same year saw hostilities begin in Algeria. The British colony in Gold Coast was moving towards its independence, and voices calling for secession were heard more and more often in places like Togoland and Cameroon, two UN trust territories that France governed, but which were not exactly French colonies. Under these circumstances, Paris decided to cut its losses. In 1956, independence was granted to Morocco and Tunisia, while Togoland became an autonomous republic within the French Union. Essentially, this meant self-government, and it wasn't limited to Togoland. For the rest of its portion of Black Africa, the Ministry for Overseas France prepared a document crucial to the history of decolonization, the Loi Cadre. This enabling act allowed for universal suffrage in a single electoral college and gave elected territorial assemblies ministerial powers over colonial governments. France retained the responsibility for foreign affairs, defense, police, the customs service, the financial and monetary regime, communications, the media, and higher education, but all other public services became local responsibility. La Loi Cadre had several important effects. One was the balkanization of the two federations, French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa, as new, smaller political units emerged. The other was the transfer of responsibility for public services from the colonial authorities to the territorial assemblies. The headache of colonial upkeep became the concern of African politicians rather than France itself. Thus, if they wanted to raise salaries for civil servants, they had to do it at the expense of the rural population. In this conflict of interest, local politicians had to choose where the money would go, and whether to appeal to the privileged urban minority or to the rural majority. So it was in this atmosphere of political struggle and readjustment that another huge event happened 2 years later. The growing crisis in Algeria led to the fall of the French Fourth Republic and Charles de Gaulle's return to power. With the new Fifth Republic, the French Union would give way to a more decentralized French community, headed by the President of France. De Gaulle was well respected in Africa, but this by no means meant that his vision for Franco-African relations faced no opposition. The new constitution had to be accepted in a referendum, and a no vote in any African territory would mean that territory's independence. De Gaulle himself made it clear that if the new arrangement was rejected, it would mean secession, quote, with all its consequences. On August 21, 1958, de Gaulle set off on a tour of Africa. In Brazzaville, he offered Africans a third option alongside community and independence, namely a yes vote now, but independence at some unspecified point in the future, without breaking ties with France. In the Ivorian capital of Abidjan, he was warmly received by Houphouët-Boigny, who also happened to be de Gaulle's Minister of State. In the Ghanaian capital Conakry, however, things didn't go as well. In de Gaulle's presence, Sékou Touré made a fiery speech which included words which have become somewhat famous in Francafrique. Quote, "There is no dignity without freedom. We prefer poverty in freedom to wealth in slavery. We do not and never shall renounce our legitimate right to independence." De Gaulle, somewhat frustrated, moved to Dakar in Senegal. There, he was met by the mayor of the city, radical party members, trade unionists, and a lot of young people shouting, "Down with de Gaulle." The speeches given by the Senegalese officials were not that different in content from the ones in Guinea, but were much more diplomatic in tone and emphasized that they did not want to break all ties with France. De Gaulle, in turn, addressed the protesting crowds, noting that if they want independence, let them take it on September 28. When the referendum went ahead throughout Africa, the yes option won a resounding victory. In most territories, African politicians were in favor of keeping ties with France and campaigned for the community. There was one, however, significant outlier: Guinea. On the 2nd of October 1958, after an overwhelming rejection of the new constitution, Guinea proclaimed its independence from France. De Gaulle aimed to deter other territories from secession and took a harsh stance on the new country. All French personnel were withdrawn from Guinea and all assistance was terminated, sometimes quite literally. While leaving, the French administrators took with them anything they could carry, often leaving their offices empty, sometimes including the telephones being ripped off of the walls. Now, despite the results of the referendum, it didn't take that long for most other French colonies to follow Guinea's lead and declare independence. In the new Fifth Republic, there were no African delegates in the National Assembly. The youth wings of the African political parties, who were always more radical than the party mainstream, became increasingly vocal and influential. In Cameroon, there was even an active guerrilla insurgency. Albeit not a large-scale rebellion, it still had one of the most curious flags of the era. Both French and African politicians increasingly favored the idea of independence in friendship with France. The only question that remained was whether independence would be granted to territories or to federations, at least of some sort. In January 1959, the four territories of Senegal, French Sudan, Dahomey, and Upper Volta organized themselves into the Mali Federation, which adopted its own constitution and became a state within the French community. The strongest opposition to federalism, on the other hand, came from Ivory Coast and its soon-to-be president, Houphouët-Boigny. The Ivorian response was to organize a customs union with Niger, Dahomey, and Upper Volta. The two latter states consequently left the Mali Federation. The leadership of the Rump Mali, increasingly frustrated by both Frenchmen and Ivorians, declared its intention to become independent. De Gaulle, who was by that time frankly tired of all this, was more than happy to get rid of what he saw as a colonial burden. Soon, the wave of independence declarations took over most of French Africa. In 1960, the Year of Africa, independence was declared one by Cameroon, Togo, Mali Federation, Madagascar, Dahomey, Niger, Upper Volta, Ivory Coast, Chad, Central African Republic, Congo-Brazzaville, Gabon, and Mauritania. In each one of these cases, the guiding formula was independence and friendship with France. What exactly this friendship meant was defined in bilateral agreements tailored to the needs and wishes of each new state. Cooperation with Mali, for example, only included economic and technical assistance. Most other colonies, however, concluded a wide range of agreements on diplomatic, defense, economic, monetary, financial, commercial, and technical assistance. The colonial currency, the CFA franc, has mostly remained in use even today, with wide accusations of neocolonialism on the part of Paris as a result. To learn more about the new nations and the role of France in their post-colonial history, let's take a short look at each of those countries individually. This will be a brief overview, keep in mind, and we will look deeper at some of these countries in future episodes. Let's start with Guinea. It was not entirely out of the orbit of French interest, despite its resounding no vote in the 1958 referendum. Twice in 1959 and 1960, France covertly tried to topple Touré, unsuccessfully. The Ghanaian president grew increasingly paranoid and regarded any political opposition as French subversion. For 26 years, Touré ruled Guinea as a dictator, presiding over a nation with a collapsed economy and a terrible human rights record. In Cameroon, power was assumed by Amadou Adijo, a Muslim from the north of the country. He defeated the guerrilla movement, the one with the crab flag, that fought against the French, and made his political party, the Cameroonian Union, the only legal political party in the country. In 1972, Cameroon united with British Cameroons, and even today, the country has a significant Anglophone minority. The first president of Togo, Sylvanus Olympio, would not live long enough to establish a dictatorship. He was killed in a coup in 1963, and his successor was deposed as well in 1967. The person behind both coups, Gnassabe Idiama, would rule Togo for 38 years by means of extensive repression, a cult of personality, and French support. Mali Federation would last for a total of 5 months before it split into its two constituent states. Senegal, the smaller but more economically prosperous of the two, would be somewhat of a democracy. Although its first leader, Leopold Senghor, won 4 elections in a row and ruled the country for 20 years, he mostly tolerated political opposition, but not without exceptions, as the country was a one-party state from 1963 to 1976. Along with Ghana and Tanzania, Senegal experimented with African socialism, but was aligned with the Western European socialists rather than the Soviet Union. The larger of the two states in the Mali Federation, French Sudan, kept the federation name for itself and has since been known as Mali. Under Modibo Keïta, Mali looked for an alliance with Ghana and Guinea and broke its monetary connection to France. Mali, however, was unable to obtain outside loans, and soon its currency became worthless. Shortly after, Keïta was overthrown and the new military government rejoined the franc zone. In Madagascar, the transition to independence was rather more smooth. During the 13-year-long rule of Philbert Tsiranana, ties with France were maintained, and French settlers remained in positions of power. This first Malagasy Republic, however, ended in a violent coup despite the presence of French forces in the country. Under the Second Malagasy Republic, which would last until the end of the Cold War, Madagascar moved towards socialism, cut ties with France, and drew its legitimacy from the failed Malagasy Uprising of 1947. Upon achieving independence, Dahomey didn't have a dominant political party. Instead, 3 leading parties traded power with each other and the army until 1972, when a group of young officers under Mathieu Kérékou seized power. Arguing that the word Dahomey was only representative of a part of the country, it was renamed Benin after the Bight of Benin. Until the end of the Cold War, Benin would be a people's republic aiming for Soviet-style socialism. Niger would often be cited as an example of French neocolonialism. Under the single-party rule of Hamini Diori, France continued mining uranium in Niger and maintained its army and citizens there. Unable to handle corruption, droughts, and economic mismanagement, Diori was ousted in 1974. For the rest of the Cold War, Niger would be governed by the military. Perhaps the poorest of them all, Upper Volta had to rely on international aid and provide labor to Ivorian plantations just to sustain itself economically. This changed in 1984 when power was seized by Thomas Sankara. He rejected international aid, arguing that decades of this policy failed to get his nation out of poverty and dependence. He also gave the country its current name, Burkina Faso, meaning the land of honest men. Sankara is a fascinating figure, not just for what he wanted to do for his country, but the legend that has grown around him since his assassination in 1987. Definitely something we are going to come back to in the future. Burkina Faso's neighbor to the south, Ivory Coast, did experience an economic boom. Under the 33-year-long presidency of Houphouët-Boigny, The country was closely aligned with France and was fiercely opposed to the Soviet Union as well as China. Houphouët-Boigny also moved the Ivorian capital from Abidjan to his native village of Yamoussoukro, where he built the largest church in the world. In the 1980s, however, global prices of coffee and cocoa fell and the Ivorian economy almost collapsed. Chad, for its part, was poorly prepared for independence. Its arbitrary borders included sedentary agricultural peoples in the south and nomadic tribes in the north, and if you know something about history, you know that these rarely get along. It is unsurprising then that Chad spent most of the Cold War in a state of near-permanent civil war, and the weak government of President Tombalage was dependent on invited French troops. These troops remain stationed in Chad even today, by the way. But even in these conditions, Chad did manage to win a war against Libya, another story we're going to come back to because it is an amazing history. Seriously, look up the Great Toyota War. Yes, that's what it's called. Now, post-colonial Africa has had plenty of dictators, but it was the Central African Republic which hosted one of the most notorious. After seizing power in a coup in 1966, Jean Bedel Bokassa installed an erratic and arbitrary dictatorship supported by France. Bokassa was a huge fan of Napoleon, and to emulate his idol, Bokassa proclaimed himself emperor and his country the Central African Empire. After 2 years of self-declared imperial rule, however, Bokassa was ousted by French paratroopers in Operation Barracuda. The colony of Middle Congo, upon its independence, became the Republic of Congo, and thus doomed itself to be forever confused with its larger neighbor to the south, Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, hence the confusion. In just 3 years, Congo-Brazzaville witnessed the rise of a revolutionary socialist regime, which throughout the Cold War supported fellow socialists such as the Lumumbist faction in the other Congo and the MPLA in Angola. The first president of the oil-rich country of Gabon was, as you might have guessed, removed from power by a coup. However, in this case, France did not sit idly by. In 1964, French paratroopers landed in Libreville, defeated the rebellion, and restored a government friendly to France. Upon the president's death in 1967, power was transferred to his designated successor, Omar Bongo, who would rule the country for the next 41 years. Mauritania was arguably the least prepared of all the French colonies for independence. Its population was largely nomadic, and its capital, Nouakchott, did not even have enough buildings to host a national government. For 6 years, Mauritania hosted a French military mission just to be able to control its vast desert territory. It is mostly known as the last country in the world to abolish slavery in 1981. However, the practice continues unofficially to this day. The Comoros, a bit late to the party, became independent only in 1975, and immediately had a territorial dispute with France. One of the Comoro Islands, Mayotte, remains a part of France, but it is to this day claimed by the independent Comoros, and occasionally makes headlines as migrants and refugees, largely from Comoros, suffer under difficult conditions. Lastly, the French Somaliland became independent in 1977 as Djibouti, after a third referendum finally gained enough support to break away from France. And thus ended the French colonial empire in Africa. Or did it? To this day, France is repeatedly accused of owning an unofficial empire, the so-called Francafrique. African nations became independent, but many of them remained in the French sphere of influence, willfully or not. For example, states that use the CFA franc, east or west, have only limited control over their own monetary policy, with Paris remaining in ultimate control. As recent events in Niger show, the story of France and Africa continues and is yet to be fully over. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Be sure to like and subscribe and press the bell button before a rebellion breaks out against the bell button, waving a flag with some sort of strange crustacean on it. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.